Hello students, this is Dr. Faizan Mirza. Here we are discussing the phases of action potential and how your membrane is actually at resting membrane potential, how it depolarizes, and what allows the membrane to repolarize. So here we will be discussing three phases, and we'll keep in mind that we are inside an axon or a neuron, and we know that how do we just record the changes in the potential difference from the neuron. We place a surface electrode at the surface of the cell, and we insert the other inside. This is the recording electrode, this is the surface electrode, and the difference in the potential is taken on the meter here, which is the voltmeter. So let's start our discussion of the first phase here of how electrical signal can initiate. So the phases of impulse transmission. The first phase is resting membrane potential. As discussed previously, we know that the value of resting membrane potential is minus 70 millivolts. Resting membrane potential is abbreviated as RMP. Here I am drawing the cross section of an axon. Cross section means you are cutting the axon along its width and you are trying to see it so that it appears circular. This is the inside of the axon, this is the outside of the axon, and the membrane of the axon is called neurolemma. On the neurolemma, which is the membrane of the axon, there is a protein pump, which is the sodium-potassium pump. We are very well aware of how sodium-potassium pump works. Sodium-potassium pump is one of the major pumps of the body, which uses active transport to push 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions are brought in the cell. When this exchange is occurring, sodium keeps going out, and since this is active transport, we know that as sodium is going out, there must already be a high sodium concentration outside. And as potassium ions are coming in by active transport, this means that already inside the cell there will be more potassium ions. So 3 sodium ions move out, 2 potassium ions enter, and ATP is hydrolyzed, which means it's broken down. And this is an example of active transport. So outside the cell, there is a high sodium concentration, a low potassium concentration. Inside the cell, there is a low sodium concentration and high potassium concentration. Electrochemical gradient is established in this case. And this electrochemical gradient basically allows a membrane potential to be set up. This exchange of ions which is occurring here, we know which ion is low inside and which one is high inside, which one is low outside and which one is high outside. You can just remember this, as one of my students discussed this with me, that if you just recall the term Nokia, and probably you can just keep that in mind, that Nokia stands for like sodium outside and potassium inside, active transport. So you can say that. You can see this very well here. So this is Nokia, this is sodium, and this is outside. So this is sodium is always outside, high by active transport. And Nokia, potassium is inside and it's high, and this is all occurring by active transport. Yeah, that's a useful acronym, by the way. So what have we done? We have placed a surface electrode and we have inserted one inside, and the voltmeter reading here tells us that the value is about minus 70 millivolts. Why is a minus 70 millivolts value recorded from the inside? This is because the exchange is of 3:2. 3 positive ions are going out and 2 potassium ions which are positive, they are entering. So whenever 3 positive ions goes out and 2 positive ions come in, there is a net deficit of 1 positive charge inside the cell. And this 1 positive charge deficiency inside the cell eventually builds up into a relatively negative environment as compared to outside. So outside the cell, there are excess of positive charges, which is reflected as excess positivity outside, and a relatively negative environment is present inside the cell. So this is called as resting membrane potential. Sodium potassium pump is working on every cell membrane. In our cell, it's working 24/7 at a constant rate. Almost 25% of your body's ATP is utilized by the sodium potassium pumps all across your body in every cell. Right now, when sodium potassium pump is working and no other protein is working, or the ionic charges are balanced in this way, so in this case we can say that the membrane potential is at RMP, and this value is minus 70 millivolts. So RMP I have shaded here, RMP as minus 70 millivolts. Moving on to the second phase of impulse transmission. Here we see that the cell can become depolarized. What is depolarization? Depolarization actually refers to the cell losing its polarity or cell losing the minus 70 millivolt value. How this occurs? Sodium ions start to flow inside the cell slowly by facilitated diffusion because the membrane becomes suddenly permeable to sodium ions. So whenever an impulse is to be initiated or whenever a cell part begins to initiate the propagation of impulse, it undergoes a permeability increment for sodium ions. So more sodium ions start to enter at a certain point in the cell. So this entry of sodium into the cell occurs by facilitated diffusion. So sodium ions move into the cell and this occurs slowly, gradually. This is called depolarizing the membrane from resting membrane potential to a value of threshold. Now, how is the membrane potential changing from the value of minus 70, which is your resting membrane potential, to a value of threshold? So this sodium ion influx, which is occurring slowly, it depolarizes the membrane to this value. Now, how is this occurring? We'll discuss this later. Once the value of membrane potential changes from minus 70 to the threshold value, RMP, you can recall the value was minus 70 millivolt, threshold value is minus 55 millivolt. So a membrane must depolarize to a value of threshold which is minus 55 millivolts, which is occurring because of slowly sodium ion diffusing into the cell. This shift of potential from minus 70 to minus 55, it opens up voltage gated sodium channels in the cell membrane and the cell suddenly becomes highly permeable to sodium ions. The localized depolarization because of sodium ions is greatly enhanced, so sodium comes and sodium comes even more. So this is an example of a positive feedback. The sodium ions entered and this actually triggered even more sodium ions to enter even at a faster pace. So sodium ions start to rapidly move into the cell and this depolarizes the cell from minus 55 to the full depolarized value, which is plus 30. So as we discussed earlier, that the membrane depolarizes, and how the membrane gets fully depolarized, the value initially was minus 70 millivolts, which was RMP. From RMP, the value turned to minus 55, which was the threshold value. From minus 55, there was a rapid sodium influx, which I have denoted by this green dot here. These are your voltage gated sodium channels. These voltage gated sodium channels, they allow sodium ions to enter into the cell. These voltage gated sodium channels open when the value of membrane potential comes at minus 55 millivolts. This is the gate which opens because of the membrane being depolarized to minus 55. So for example, if the membrane was at minus 70 millivolt, the sodium voltage gated channels will be closed because the voltage gated channel, which is specific for sodium, opens at minus 55 millivolt only. So this much amount of depolarization must already have occurred to open up voltage gated sodium channels. The moment these voltage gated sodium channels open, sodium rapidly moves into the cell, depolarizing the membrane to a full value of plus 30 millivolts. Beyond plus 30 millivolts in human neurons or even human muscles, more sodium ions cannot enter because the voltage gated sodium channel shuts down at plus 30 millivolts. So the gate of voltage gated sodium channel opens at minus 55 and closes at plus 30. And during this time, it allows facilitated diffusion of sodium ions into the cell from outside to inside. The shift of potential from minus 70 to minus 55 is depolarizing from resting membrane potential to threshold. From minus 55 to plus 30 is the membrane getting fully depolarized from threshold to a fully depolarized value. Both depolarizations because of sodium ion moving inside the cell by facilitated diffusion but through different pathways. The transition where the threshold value is reached and the moment threshold value is touched, the impulse is generated. So this is primarily where an action potential or an impulse is generated in a neuron, that the membrane must depolarize to a value of minus 55. This is described by all and none phenomena or all or none law. What is all and none law? The all and none law states that if the membrane depolarizes to a value of minus 55, you will have all, which means that voltage gated sodium channels will start to open and an action potential or impulse will be generated. But if the membrane did not depolarize fully to a minus 55 value of threshold, it stayed below it. For example, if it depolarized from minus 70 to minus 60, or for example minus 58. So that means the value is still below threshold. In that case, the action potential or impulse will not be generated, and the law of none will be applied. So in neurons or in excitable cell, we have all or none happening. If threshold is reached, it's all, which means voltage gated sodium channels will open up. They all will pop and they will allow sodium ions to enter into the cell. And if these channels do not open up, it means that the value of resting potential from minus 70 millivolt did not rise up to minus 55. It stayed below. Now we'll be moving on to the third phase of impulse transmission, which is repolarization. Now what happens with repolarization? A third kind of protein comes here doing its function, and these are called as voltage-gated potassium channels. Voltage-gated potassium channels are fully opened by plus 30 millivolts. When they are fully opened by plus 30 millivolt, they allow potassium ions to move out of the cell by facilitated diffusion. As potassium ions go out, the efflux of these potassium ions allow positive charges to go out of the cell. When positive charges are lost from the cell, this loss of positive charges from the cell repolarizes the membrane from plus 30 value back to minus 70 millivolt. The voltage gated channels then close at minus 70 millivolts, allowing resting membrane potential to be retained. But now the sodium and potassium concentrations have been disturbed. Outside you have a high potassium concentration, and inside you have a high sodium concentration, which is a bit different of what scenario we had initially at RMP, although RMP is achieved. How is this reverted back? This is again reverted back by sodium potassium pump working. That sodium is again pushed out by 3 sodium ions at a time, and 2 potassiums keep coming in, 2 at a time, and this exchange is an active transport process. So all along the 3 phases that I've just discussed in repolarization, depolarization, or threshold, or any part that I've discussed so far, sodium potassium pump was constantly working at a constant pace. Although when potassium charges were going out during repolarization, this movement of potassium charges or potassium ion, it actually overcame what effect the sodium potassium pump had. Similarly, when sodium ions were moving into the cell, and even at this time sodium potassium pump was working in the membrane, but it keeps working at a constant rate. So its effect is nullified when sodium is moving into the cell and the cell suddenly becomes highly permeable to sodium. These are the phases of impulse transmission. So let's just have a look of these phases on a graph here. This graph here represents x-axis, which is time in milliseconds, and the y-axis represents the membrane potential in millivolts. This graph shows to you how the membrane potential changes. So you can see the value of RMP, the value of threshold can be seen. If you see on this graph, I have shown to you this point here. This value is minus 70, so this is resting membrane potential. This value is threshold, this is minus 55. So you can see that action potential is generated when the value of membrane potential rises up from RMP to threshold, and action potential is generated here. And this generation of action potential is because of how sodium ions are moving into the cell. And again, we can keep this in mind. This is how the electrodes were placed to see how the voltage changes along the neuron from a negative value to a positive value. From this point, this point 1 that I've just mentioned, this is because of sodium ions slowly coming into the cell. They depolarize the membrane from minus 70 to minus 55. This is depolarized to the threshold value. At minus 55 millivolts, we know that the voltage-gated sodium channels open up and rapid depolarization occurs to plus 30 millivolts because sodium ions start to enter into the cell, and this this line here represents how the membrane gets fully depolarized to plus 30. At plus 30, we know that further entry of sodium cannot be continued because sodium voltage-gated channels is closed here. The gate opened at minus 55, the gate closed at plus 30. Now, at this point, the membrane is completely depolarized, and at plus 30, sodium gated channel is closed and voltage gated potassium channel is fully opened. The moment the voltage gated potassium channel is fully opened, potassium ions start to go out of the cell and the membrane start to lose the positive charges because the positive potassium ions are going out by voltage gated potassium channels, and the value drops down to RMP once again. So once minus 70 is reached, minus 70 the voltage gated potassium channels then close and the RMP value is retained. But we see that most of the time the resting membrane potential is not retained, rather the membrane potential goes even below resting membrane potential, and this is termed as hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization means that the membrane is now even more negative than it was before, and this is the refractory period. During the refractory period, it is even more difficult for the neuron or for the membrane to become excited once again, because its membrane potential is way below the resting potential. It is even more negative now. So once the refractory period is recovered and the value comes above back to the RMP value, it can again start to rise up to threshold if the stimulus is there. Here I have shown to you that in this case, the value where I'm just placing my pointer here. Here the value of RMP is shifting to threshold. This is because the stimulus was strong enough to push the sodium ions into the cell membrane, and this caused the membrane potential to shift from the minus 70 value to minus 55 value. But let's suppose in this case, what's happening here? Again, the value of RMP was minus 70. Let's suppose another stimulus comes here, but this is a very weak stimulus, and this stimulus allows sodium ions to go, but the value of potential, the resting potential, is increasing. It is rising above minus 70. It's going towards minus 60, but it is not touching minus 55 as yet. It means it stays below threshold. So in this case, it will be none, which means that action potential will not be generated because the value is not touching the threshold, and the voltage gated sodium channels will stay shut. Although at this point the reverse happened, which means that all was applied here, as I discussed earlier, that all and none law is applied. So this is all means the threshold was touched and voltage gated sodium channels start to open up and membrane that got fully depolarized. Whereas in this condition, since none was applied, because the value of depolarization stayed below threshold. That's it from my side. Thank you so much.